Hello from Wealthy Life. In this video, I will give my thoughts on how one can build wealth as a wage earner and compare a model of how this approach might work with how my own net worth progressed as a salaried employee for 40 years. Please bear in mind that while I have a master's degree in financial planning and I'm currently working on my PhD in financial planning, I'm not currently registered as a practicing financial advisor, and this video is purely for educational purposes and is not personal or general financial advice, just my thoughts on this topic. If you want to take a second to hit the like or subscribe button, that would be greatly appreciated. In this discussion, I will be using inflation-adjusted real rates of investment return after tax, and in the comparison with my figures, I've adjusted my data to 2026 values using the relevant historic CPI index values. Now, the average starting salary for a graduate in Australia is currently around $75,000 a year, and the average salary for specialist trades such as electricians and machinists is a similar rate of pay. So in my model, I've assumed a starting salary of $75,000 a year, which is fairly typical for the average graduate or qualified tradesman starting out as an employee. Income then generally rises as you spend time in the workforce and peaks at around age 50. So in the modelling, I've assumed real pay rises of $5,000 a year until it reaches the Australian average salary, which is $100,000 a year after the first 5 years, and then continues to rise more gradually at $1,000 a year until it peaks at the $120,000 a year maximum pay rate after 25 years. Salary then assumes it to remain constant at that level until retirement, which happens 40 years after you've joined the workforce. The model assumes all extra income from investments such as dividends, distributions, or rental property income is reinvested after tax. So overall, in summary, the assumptions used in my model were income starts at the average graduate starting salary of $75,000 a year. It then rises at $5,000 a year for 5 years until it reaches the Australian average salary of $100,000 a year. After that, it then continues to rise more slowly at $1,000 a year until it peaks at $120,000 a year, today's money, after 25 years in the workforce. And you then continue working with the same salary rate until you retire at 40 years in the workforce. In retirement, you continue to spend the same rate of spending that you did during your working life. Now, it's assumed that the total savings rate while working is 45%. This includes the 12% superannuation guarantee levy, which means that roughly 1/3 of take-home pay is being saved and invested, and you're spending 2/3 of take-home pay on expenses. Rent or other interest component of your home mortgage payments is considered an expense, while the principal component payment of mortgage payments is part of your savings rate. In practice, one might contribute the extra money into superannuation via salary sacrifice as a personal deductible contribution up to the sort of personal contribution cap, rather than investing after-tax income outside of super, as this would mean you're paying 15% superannuation contributions tax rate rather than your marginal tax rate and then investing after-tax money. For the income range considered in this model, which is $75,000 to $120,000 a year in today's money, 30% would be your marginal tax rate. So contributing into superannuation reduces the amount of tax up front, so you have more money being invested over the lifetime. So during the peak $120,000 a year income years from age 50 onwards, the breakdown would be your salary is $120,000 a year, which means your total package is $134,500 when you include the 12% SGL. Tax would be roughly $29,568, which is a combination of income tax and super contributions tax. This is not an exact figure, as the exact amount will depend on your taxable income, concessional super contributions made, any tax deductions, and so forth. So your income after tax would be roughly $104,832, and splitting that by my 45% savings, 55% expenses model, you'd be spending $57,658 a year, and you'd be investing $47,174 a year, including SGL. This savings rate is a lot higher than is often recommended, for example, in the 10 to 20% range of after-tax salary, but it's in line with what I actually did overall during my working life. So it's just an illustration of what can be achieved as a wage earner on a typical income. Income tax is assumed to be 22%. The average tax rate on $100,000 a year taxable income is actually 22.8%, but you'd have slightly lower tax on investment income if you're invested. I've assumed 15% due to tax deductions, the tax rate that's applicable within superannuation, and the long-term capital gains tax discount that gets applied. Average after-tax real return on investment is assumed to be 4.36% per annum. This is actually the return on investment for the ASX 200 over the past 20 years, with dividends reinvested. That figure is 8.00%. Then been adjusted for inflation, which brings it down to 5.13% in real terms during the last 20 years, and deducting the average 15% tax I've assumed applies on investments on average, leaves you with 4.6% as the assumed after-tax real rate of return. Using these assumptions in the model shows that it's possible to achieve $1 million net worth in today's money after 19 years of working. You'd hit $2 million after working for 29 years, and by retirement age, you'd have around $3.75 million net worth in today's money. This is basically the sort of approach I took as a salaried wage earner during my 40 years as an employee, although the income tax rates and the superannuation rules have changed considerably during my working life. So I've basically used the current situation. It may change over time. My starting salary at graduation was actually the equivalent of $75,000 today's money. It's increased to about $100,000 per annum after a few years. It then dipped temporarily when my first position was made redundant after 10 years in the workforce. But my salary recovered back to the $100,000 a year mark within a couple of years. It then rose more gradually to peak at around $120,000 per annum in today's money by my early 50s. And it was then fairly stagnant until I was made redundant from my IT position last year. I've plotted my actual net worth adjusted for inflation versus the calculated model projection. I've only got net worth figures for the last 22 working years. Prior to that, I'd been using a notebook during high school and university days. But then I switched to using Quicken on an old XT and then an AT and then a Pentium computer. And I don't have the files and I don't have the Quicken software and I don't have hardware to read the old files if I can find the floppies. So basically I've only got data that I've kept for the last 22 years on various versions of Excel. My results turn out to be quite similar to the model, although there's a lot more volatility, especially during the GFC, for example. Post-retirement, the model then assumes you would stop earning any wages, and instead you'd be withdrawing enough from investments to continue to sustain the same rate of spending of $57,658 a year during retirement. In comparison, the ASFA considers $50,000 a year to be the amount required for a comfortable retirement for singles during retirement, or $70,000 a year, which is $35,000 each for couples. So this 57,658 figure is quite comfortable. The age pension rate is $30,000 a year for singles and $46,000 a year for couples, or $23,000 each. So living off $48,000 a year, which is my current retirement budget, is quite comfortable and slightly below what this model would project. This modelling is for one person's income, expenses, and investing. So you might be considering this fairly conservative when you're a couple, assuming both partners are working for at least part of their employment career. Anyway, this is the outline of how I approached accumulating wealth as a salaried employee and how it turned out in my case. So let me know what you think in the comments below.